A dying veteran whispered one last request: check the tumor, real careful. What the doctors found inside left the entire hospital in tears. This is one story you'll never forget. Subscribe to see why. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had performed hundreds of surgeries in her career, some routine, some miraculous, but nothing, in her decades of medical experience, had prepared her for what she found inside Thomas McAllister's leg. The operating room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the soft hum of overhead lights. Her scalpel moved with steady precision, slicing through layers of aged tissue and muscle. The man on the table was 88 years old, a Vietnam veteran with a stubborn streak and a mysterious mass in his right thigh that he'd refused to have removed for over 50 years. Everyone assumed it was scar tissue, a war souvenir, harmless. But this was not scar tissue. Her blade hesitated, suspended midair, as her eyes locked on something embedded deep within the inflamed mass. It shimmered faintly under the surgical light, metallic, smooth and wholly unnatural. Sarah leaned in, her gloved fingers gently brushing aside swollen tissue until the object came into full view. It was a small, weathered, metallic cylinder, no bigger than a pill bottle, sealed, rusted at the edges, wrapped in what appeared to be decades-old surgical gauze. Behind her, the scrub nurse audibly gasped. The forceps in her hand clattered to the floor, breaking the sterile silence. The anesthesiologist looked up from his station, eyes narrowing as he followed Sarah's gaze to the wound. "Is that?" Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her mind was racing. This wasn't medical equipment, it wasn't shrapnel, and it definitely wasn't cancer. This was deliberate. She glanced at the name on the patient chart again. Thomas McAllister, a veteran, 88 years old, long medical history, but no prior surgeries on that leg since 1970. Nothing about this made sense. "Get the hospital administrator," she said softly, her voice barely audible through her surgical mask. "Now." The nurse bolted, nearly knocking over a tray in her haste. Sarah bent lower, inspecting the cylinder without touching it further. The outer casing was scorched and pitted, likely from decades of friction against bone and tissue, but it was intact, purposefully placed. Who would hide something like this in a man's body, and why? The room began to feel smaller, the overhead lights harsher. For a moment, Sarah forgot where she was. A rush of images flooded her mind. Snapshots of her father in uniform, of faded letters tucked away in a shoebox, of bedtime stories told in whispers by her mother about a soldier who never came home. Her father. Her throat tightened. She blinked rapidly, trying to refocus on the patient before her. It couldn't be connected. That was impossible. But the name, the age, the leg injury, something about it gnawed at the edge of her memory like a thread begging to be pulled. She steadied herself and looked to the anesthesiologist. Vitals, stable, heart rate slightly elevated, no signs of distress. She nodded and took a slow breath. Whatever this was, she would remove it safely, document it meticulously, and follow protocol. But her instincts told her this wasn't just a medical anomaly, it was a secret, a story trapped inside flesh and time, waiting to be uncovered. As she carefully began isolating the object from the surrounding tissue, she whispered more, to herself than anyone else. "What in the world have you been carrying, Mr. McAllister?" And beneath the bright, sterile lights of the operating room, history stirred awake. The small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place where nothing ever really changed. The corner diner still served black coffee that could burn a hole through steel. The hardware store still had handwritten receipts. And if you sat on the wooden bench outside the barbershop long enough, someone was bound to stop by and tell you the same story they told you last week. Maybe that was why Tommy McAllister had stayed. For the past 15 years, Tommy had perfected the art of being politely invisible. At 6'2", with a back still mostly straight despite age, and piercing steel blue eyes that seemed permanently narrowed in contemplation, he was hard to miss, but easy to overlook. His military bearing never quite left him, even after decades of civilian life. And though folks in town respected him, old soldier, lost his wife, quiet type, they didn't know much more than that. He never invited curiosity. He lived alone in a white clapboard house on Maple Street. The paint had started to peel years ago, and the shutters hung a little crooked, but he didn't care. The garden out front had gone wild with overgrown lilacs and stubborn patches of ivy, as if Nature had taken one look at Tommy's indifference and decided to grow on in spite of him. The mailbox still had his wife's name etched in faded gold lettering, Margaret Emke Allister, RN. Every morning at exactly 5 o'clock, Tommy made coffee so strong it could wake the dead. He drank it black, no sugar, no cream, just like in Vietnam. Then, like clockwork, he shuffled out to the back porch where 3 stray cats waited for him. 2 black, 1 orange, all feral in attitude but oddly loyal. He fed them bits of canned tuna and muttered the same words every single morning. A man's word is his bond. It wasn't for the cats. It was for himself. A ritual. A reminder. Some mornings, he'd sit out there a little longer, the cold Pennsylvania air biting through his worn flannel shirt. He'd stare off into the distance, as if expecting someone, or something, to arrive from beyond the tree line, but no one ever came. He didn't own a smartphone. His landline hardly rang. He had a television, but rarely used it, except to watch the Veterans Day ceremony every November. For 15 years, since the day Margaret passed away, in the very hospital where he now lay unconscious, Tommy had lived like a man counting time in reverse. Every Sunday, he walked to her grave, rain or shine, snow or wind. With a small bouquet of carnations from the grocery store, he'd stand, in silence, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. On certain days, he talked to her, told her about the cats, about their daughter, Becky, about Jake. He never told her about the tumor. The thing on his leg had started out as a lump, small, painless. Back then, the doctors had offered to remove it, assuming it was a leftover calcification from a wartime injury. But Tommy had refused, again and again. He claimed it didn't bother him, claimed he didn't want to waste anyone's time. But the truth, which he never told a soul, was more complicated than that. He knew what was inside. Not exactly, not fully, but enough to know that removing it meant risking something sacred. Over the years, it grew from a walnut to a golf ball, and eventually to the size of a softball. Still, he limped through his days, told anyone who asked that it was just an old wound that acts up in the winter. Becky had begged him to have it checked. Jake had offered to drive him to the VA clinic himself, but Tommy wouldn't budge. "There are promises you make in war," he once told Jake, "the kind that don't expire." And so he endured the pain, the weight, the slow decay. Not because he was brave, not because he was proud, but because of something he hadn't yet named, something he hadn't yet faced. But now, as his body lay under sterile lights and skilled hands worked to unlock a half-century-old secret, the town of Millbrook remained unaware that one of their own had been carrying a piece of history inside him. Not just scar tissue, not just metal, something far heavier. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had grown up on stories that tasted like ashes. She was 5 when her mother first told her about Vietnam, not the dates or battles, but the man, Marcus Mitchell, her father. He'd died in a jungle she couldn't find on a map, in a war that even grown-ups didn't know how to talk about. Her mother kept his medals in a shoebox, and his letters in a velvet pouch. She'd read them aloud sometimes, especially on the anniversaries, always ending with the same one, a short, unfinished note to his 2 girls, folded so many times the paper had softened like linen. Sarah had gone into medicine because of that man, not to become a hero, but to save someone, anyone, that another child might not lose a father like she did. She'd worked her way through the ranks of the VA system, from exhausted intern to chief surgeon at Veterans Memorial Hospital, where she now stood, scrubbing her hands with a ferocity that made the junior nurse flinch. She didn't know why her hands were trembling. Not fully. Thomas McAllister. The name had tickled something in the back of her mind ever since the ER team called her in. An elderly vet with a massive leg tumor. Daughter begged for best surgeon available. The moment she saw his chart, it was like a key clicking in a lock she didn't know was there. The birth year, the service number, the campaign dates. Alpha Company, 1st Infantry Division, Vietnam, 1968. Same unit as her father, same months, same hell. She hadn't allowed herself to feel much when they rolled him into the OR, just enough to do the job. But now that she'd seen what he carried inside his body, a sealed metal container, hidden like a time capsule in rotting flesh, she couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't just another patient. He was a messenger, or maybe a monument. She didn't know it yet, but she'd soon find her father's voice inside that man. That same morning, a crowd was gathering across town at Millbrook Veterans Park. It was November 11th, Veterans Day, and the air was the kind of cold that bit straight through to your bones. But Tommy M.C. Allister had shown up, same as he had for the past 52 years. He'd dressed in his old service jacket, polished his purple heart pin, and combed his thinning white hair. Becky had tried to stop him. She'd seen how pale he looked, how badly the infection had begun to affect him. But Tommy wouldn't hear of it. 52 years I've been going, he grunted, wincing as he stepped into her Honda Civic. I ain't missing it now. He walked with a limp, barely noticeable if you didn't know what to look for. But Jake saw it. He always did. The boy stood near the parking lot, hands jammed into his coat pockets, trying not to hover. He watched his grandfather move slowly toward the bronze memorial statue, toward the names carved in cold stone. Tommy always stood in the same spot, not too close, not too far, just close enough to see the names, to remember them. As the ceremony began, flags unfurling, speeches about courage and freedom, echoing through the PA system, Tommy removed his cap and bowed his head. For 23 minutes he didn't move. 1 minute for each man who didn't come home. He could still see them. Jimmy Patterson, with his crooked grin and a baby on the way. Bobby Coleman, who wrote letters home every day until the day he couldn't. And Marcus Mitchell, 23 years old, carried a photo of his daughter like it was a lifeline. Spoke about her like she was already the smartest, kindest, most unstoppable little girl in the world. As the high school band began to play taps, Tommy felt the weight in his chest shift. His leg burned. The infected tumor pulsed like a second heartbeat. The world around him started to spin, not fast but slowly, like a carousel winding down. And then, he saw him. Marcus, stepping out of the memory, still in fatigues, still young, still carrying dirt and fire in his eyes. Time to let go, old friend, the voice whispered. You kept your promise long enough. Tommy's knees buckled. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the old veteran collapsed to the ground, his medals scattering into the fallen leaves. Becky screamed from the edge of the crowd, shoving through bystanders as she dropped to her knees beside her father. Her training kicked in. Checked pulse, loosened collar, skin fever hot, angry red streaks now visible beneath his pants leg. The infection had spread. Call 911, she shouted, voice sharp and clear even as her hands shook. Jake was already running, dropping beside her. Grandpa, stay with us. Please, don't go. Not now. For a brief moment, Tommy's eyes fluttered open. He found Becky's hand, squeezed it with more strength than he should have had. If something happens, he rasped, tell them. Check the tumor. Careful. Then he slipped back into unconsciousness. The ambulance came quickly. But for Becky and Jake, it felt like eternity. As they followed the stretcher into the ER bay of Veterans Memorial Hospital, neither of them realized that doctor. Sarah Mitchell was already scrubbing in, preparing to uncover the secret that had lived inside the man they loved. And outside, the leaves continued to fall in silence, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the hum of fluorescent lights. The recovery room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed, tightly over her chest, eyes locked on the sleeping man before her. Thomas and Allister. He looked impossibly fragile now, all 6'2" of him swallowed by white hospital sheets and time. The swelling in his leg had been worse than anticipated. The infection was aggressive, deep, wrapping itself around decades-old scar, tissue infusing with the metallic object they had removed during surgery. And that object, that object, was now secured inside a sealed forensic container, resting in her office like a time bomb made of memory. Sarah had barely slept since the operation. The moment she'd seen his military file, the puzzle pieces started snapping into place. 1st Infantry Division, Alpha Company, Vietnam, 1968 to 1970. The same company, same years. She'd read those details before, in yellowed government letters, in her mother's whispered prayers, in the margins of the journals she had secretly written as a teenager, trying to stitch together a man she'd never met. But there was more than paperwork binding them. There was a letter. Sarah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the weathered photograph she always carried. It was soft at the edges, creased from years of folding and unfolding. A young soldier, Marcus Mitchell, stood proud in his uniform, holding a baby in his arms. On the back, in her mother's careful script, Marcus with baby Sarah, spring 1978. She stared at it now, her throat tightening. He'd spoken often about a friend, her mother used to say. A brother in arms. Someone named Tommy, who had made a promise. Sarah had grown up wondering who he was. Now, here he was, lying in the hospital bed under her care, carrying a story she never imagined. She didn't notice the shift at first, the subtle flutter of eyelids, the way his hand twitched under the sheet. But when she looked up, Tommy MC Allister was staring straight at her. His eyes were clear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the years collapsed between them, folding in on themselves until all that remained was silence and breath and the sound of their histories overlapping. "Sweet Jesus," Tommy whispered, his voice gravelly but sure. "You've got Marcus's eyes." Sarah's breath hitched. "You're his little girl, aren't you?" She nodded, unable to trust her voice. Tommy's hand lifted, shaking slightly as he reached toward the photograph still clutched in her fingers. He carried that picture with him every day, he murmured. Kept it next to his heart, said it reminded him why he had to come home. Sarah stepped closer, tears gathering in her lashes. "Mr. Allister," she whispered. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Marcus Mitchell was my father." He closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. When he opened them again, they were glossy with emotion. "Your daddy saved my life," he said. "But before he did, he asked me to carry something for him, for all of them." Sarah's heart pounded. "You mean the object we found, inside the tumor?" Tommy nodded slowly. "It wasn't just shrapnel, wasn't a souvenir. It was a promise I've been keeping for 52 years. Becky stood just outside the room, arms wrapped around her own body as if she could shield herself from everything crashing down at once. She had spent the past 48 hours in a fog. Surgery, finances. A foreclosure notice stuffed into her purse like a loaded gun. Her father had always been stubborn, always mysterious, but now there were letters, secrets, doctors speaking in hushed tones, and the old man she'd almost given up on was suddenly a national headline. Jake sat nearby, hunched in a waiting room chair, staring at the floor. He hadn't said much since the ER, not since his grandfather had collapsed in front of him like a falling monument. Inside the room, Dr. Mitchell pulled up a chair. "Mr. MC Allister," she said gently. "Can you tell me what was inside the container?" Tommy's face tightened with memory. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached for the water on the side table, took a slow sip, and looked her dead in the eye. "There were 23 letters," he said, "one from each man who didn't make it home." Sarah blinked. "Letters?" "Final words," Tommy whispered. "They wrote them the night before we were supposed to ship out. We were in the jungle. We knew we weren't getting out. Some of us didn't. Marcus. He made me promise. If I survived, I had to get those letters home. And Maria, the field medic, she..." He stopped, overcome. Sarah leaned in. "Maria Santos? Her name was on one of my dad's letters." Tommy nodded. "She knew I was the only one who might live long enough. So she sealed them up, wrapped them, and when the evac chopper came, she hid them. In me." "In you?" Sarah's voice trembled. Tommy placed a hand over his thigh. "In the wound," he said. "Deep, near the bone. Told the surgeon to leave it, said it was shrapnel, told them not to cut it out unless I was dying. And for 52 years I wasn't." Sarah was speechless. "You carried them all this time," she whispered. "I couldn't open them," he said. "Didn't have the right. They weren't mine to read. They were for mothers, wives, children. For you." Tears slipped silently down Sarah's face. "One of them, one of those letters, is from my father." Tommy nodded. "I've never read it, but I know it's there outside the room." Becky leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. Her father, the man she thought she knew, had carried 23 souls inside him for over half a century. Jake stood beside her now, eyes wide. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you think the letters are okay? After all that time?" Becky swallowed hard. "I don't know, baby, but if they are, it changes everything." Inside the hospital room, Sarah reached out, placed her hand gently over Tommy's. "Mr. MC Allister," she said, "I promise you, we'll preserve every single one. We'll get them to their families, and I'll make sure my mother reads my father's final words." Tommy smiled faintly. "Then I've done what I came to do." Outside the window, the late afternoon light turned golden, casting long shadows across the floor. The past was no longer buried. and the promise that had lived in silence for 52 years was finally beginning to speak. The operating room had the tense quiet of a courtroom just before a verdict. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the head of the surgical table, flanked by a hand-picked team of the hospital's most skilled staff. A second scrub nurse stood off to the side with a high-definition camera, documenting every step, not for publicity, but for historical preservation. The small metal container they'd recovered from Tommy MC Allister's infected thigh had drawn national attention within hours. By morning, the Veterans Memorial Hospital was flooded with phone calls, emails, and even hand-delivered letters from across the country. Everyone wanted to know, was the story true? Sarah didn't care about the attention. What mattered to her was the 23 letters that might still be inside that corroded, sealed capsule. Letters written by soldiers who had never made it home, including her own father. What mattered was the man lying unconscious in front of her, who had risked infection, pain, and death to protect something sacred. This was no longer just surgery. This was an extraction of legacy. The tumor was far more complex than imaging had suggested. It had calcified in places, fused with muscle fibers and nerve tissue, and wrapped around major blood vessels. In some areas, the growth had formed its own vascular system, sustained by years of slow, stubborn defiance. Tommy had carried it like a shield, and now removing it felt like defusing a bomb. "Clamp here," Sarah said, her voice steady but quiet. "Careful, don't rupture the sheath." The room moved in practiced silence. Gauze soaked with blood was replaced with fresh rolls. Monitors beeped. A suction tube hissed as Sarah continued the meticulous work of separating tissue from history. By hour 3, the team had reached the heart of the mass. The metal container was still partially embedded. Time had etched its surface, and the infection had begun to corrode its edges. But the seal held. Sarah could see faint outlines, possibly labels or maybe handwriting, faded into the oxidized metal. Her chest tightened. "Scalpel," she murmured. She made the final incision, sliding the container free and placing it gently into a sterile collection tray. A nurse sealed it in a specimen case and handed it off to hospital preservation staff who were waiting just outside the OR. They would work with historians and document specialists to assess and stabilize its contents. Sarah exhaled slowly, then turned her focus back to closing the surgical site. The hardest part was over, but the risk to Tommy's life was not. He had lost more blood than expected. His age, coupled with the infection, meant every stitch, every dose of anesthesia, carried its own danger. Still, he was holding on. Back in the waiting room, Becky paced like a lioness in a cage. She'd been a nurse for over 20 years, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of helplessness. Jake sat in the corner, still in his McDonald's uniform, clutching his phone and refreshing a social media page where someone had posted, "Local war hero's body hides 23 lost letters from Vietnam." The post had gone viral in under an hour. Outside the hospital, reporters had begun to gather. Veterans from nearby counties started arriving too. Men in wheelchairs, women with ribbons on their lapels, families carrying folded flags and faded photographs. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. Something was happening here. Something important. One of the veterans, a man in his 70s wearing a battered airborne cap, approached Becky. "I served with Alpha Company too," he said, his voice low and reverent. "If your father kept those letters, then he did something no one else had the courage to do." Becky blinked back tears. "He never talked about it," she said. "About any of it." "Sometimes," the man replied, "the things worth keeping hurt too much to speak aloud." At hour 5, Sarah was dealing with unexpected complications, ruptured tissue, blood loss, a brief dip in oxygen saturation. But Tommy rallied. The man who had carried war inside his body for 5 decades wasn't going down easy. By hour 6, the bleeding had slowed. The infection site had been flushed. The team worked in coordinated precision, every movement calm, focused. At hour 7, Sarah finally made the last suture. She stepped back, peeling off her gloves, drenched in sweat but trembling with relief. "Vitals?" she asked. "Stable," the anesthesiologist said, holding. She let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her chest since childhood. "He made it," she whispered. The OR team broke into smiles, exhausted but proud. They had saved a man's life, and maybe the final words of 23 others. As they wheeled Tommy into post-op, Sarah followed the sealed case into a controlled examination room where experts in document preservation were already setting up. A representative from the American Battle Monuments Commission stood waiting. Sarah handed the case over carefully, like passing a newborn child. "Be careful," she said. "You're holding history." The letter came the next morning, tucked in a plain manila envelope and hand-delivered, by a grim-faced sheriff's deputy who apologized before he even spoke. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't have a choice. Legally, I have to serve this in person." Becky nodded numbly, her hands trembling as she accepted the papers. She didn't open them right away. She didn't need to. She already knew what they were. Foreclosure. She stood outside the hospital entrance, frozen in place as the deputy walked away. For a long moment, she stared at the envelope, then tucked it into her purse like it was radioactive. The hospital's automatic doors slid shut behind her with a hiss. Inside, everything felt wrong. Just yesterday, the world had started looking up. Her father had survived surgery, the letters had been recovered, the media coverage had transformed him from a stubborn old man into a national hero. And yet none of it paid the mortgage. She found Jake in the cafeteria, hunched over a plastic tray of eggs he wasn't eating. His eyes were red, not from tears but from the kind of fatigue that settled into your bones when hope was the only thing keeping you upright. He looked up when he saw her, but didn't smile. She sat down across from him and didn't speak for a while. Finally, she reached into her bag and placed the envelope on the table between them. Jake stared at it. "How long?" he asked. 72 hours, she said quietly. 3 days. Jake nodded slowly. "How much?" 47,000, she replied. "We're behind on the second mortgage. The insurance covered 60% of Grandpa's surgery, but the rest..." Her voice broke. "I've been putting everything on credit, trying to keep the lights on. I thought if we just held on a little longer..." She stopped. Jake reached for the envelope, but Becky quickly slid it back into her purse. "I didn't want you to see that," she whispered. "Why?" he asked, not accusing, just tired. "I'm not a kid." Becky looked at him, really looked at him. 16, but with the eyes of someone much older. He hadn't had a childhood, not since the cancer took his father, and the bills took everything else. He worked 35 hours a week and called it a gap semester like it was a vacation, and now he was quietly drowning. "Because I didn't want you to think it was your job to fix it," she said. Jake didn't respond. He just looked down at the tray of eggs again. An hour later, while Becky was upstairs with the doctors discussing Tommy's post-op treatment, Jake slipped away. He took the bus downtown and walked into the Army recruitment office. The man behind the desk looked up from his paperwork. He was older, 60s maybe, wearing a crisp uniform and a knowing smile. "You lost?" he asked kindly. Jake straightened. "I want to enlist." The recruiter raised an eyebrow. "How old are you, son?" 16, Jake said. The man leaned back in his chair. "Thought so. You need to be 17 to sign with parental consent. 18 without. I'll be 17 in 2 months. The recruiter nodded, folding his hands on the desk. "Why now?" Jake hesitated. "I need the bonus," he said finally. "My family's losing our house." The man didn't laugh or scoff. He didn't give a canned speech about patriotism. Instead, he looked Jake straight in the eye. "Does your grandfather know you're here?" Jake shook his head. The recruiter leaned forward. "Son, I've been where you are. I served in Vietnam. I've met boys who signed up because they were running from something. But let me tell you something your grandpa would say if he were standing here. Serving your country should never be plan B for saving your family." Jake swallowed hard. "I'm not trying to run away," he whispered. "I just don't see another way out." The recruiter's voice softened. "There's always another way. It might be ugly, it might hurt, but there's always another way." Jake left the office with a business card in his pocket and a storm in his chest. When he got back to the hospital, Becky was waiting for him in Tommy's room. She saw the look on his face and knew. "You didn't," she said. "I just asked questions," Jake replied, sitting in the chair beside her. She turned away, pressing her fist to her mouth. "I can't lose you too," she whispered. Tommy, still weak from surgery, stirred at the sound. He opened his eyes and looked at them both. His voice was raspy but clear. "What's going on?" Jake hesitated, then looked his grandfather straight in the eye. "I tried to enlist," he said. "I thought maybe if I got the bonus..." Tommy raised a trembling hand. "No," Jake blinked. "But I spent 52 years carrying the burden of boys who never came home." Tommy said, "Don't you dare put yourself on that list because of me." Jake's lip quivered. "But we're losing everything." Tommy looked at Becky, then back to Jake. "Some promises aren't worth your life," he said. "This family is, but not like that. We'll find another way." And for the first time in days, the silence between them wasn't despair. It was the sound of three people finally, truly, holding on. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the preservation lab into the hallway, her medical gown still clinging to her shoulders like a second skin she'd forgotten to shed. She carried a folder heavy with hope and fear. Her fingers trembled against the edge as she read through the legal language. Again, feeling like she was dragging a chain behind her shoes, she found Becky in the nurse's lounge, head bowed over a half-empty cup of stained coffee. Beside her, a stack of mail lay waiting, unopened. "I spoke with the bank this morning," Sarah began quietly, her voice skipping in places. Becky looked up instantly, eyes wide with expectation. They said Marcus's account is considered abandoned. The last activity was 30 years ago. No designated beneficiary. Legally, it's been escheated to the state." Becky's breath caught. The quiet hum of electric lights suddenly sounded too loud. "Escheated?" she echoed, her voice brittle. "Taken over by the state treasury. Pennsylvania unclaimed property laws kicked in. Without a will or letters testamentary, there's no way to access the funds immediately." Becky's shoulders slumped. Years of mortgage payments, medical bills, surgery. I thought that money might." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "They said we can file a claim, as descendants of the account holder. But it could take months, even years. They've transferred the money into a state-held fund, and now it's essentially locked until cleared." Becky closed her eyes, a tear tracing down her cheek. Sarah inhaled and pressed on. "I contacted the Bureau of Unclaimed Property. They require formal documentation, proof of relationship, death certificate, sworn affidavits, and possibly letters of administration from the estate. They adjudicate each claim on a case-by-case basis." Becky stared at the wall as if suddenly seeing it for the first time. "Sarah," she whispered, "Jake was going to join the military tomorrow. He said that bonus could delay the foreclosure, and now we might lose everything." Sarah's heart ached. "We will not lose this home, I promise you that. There are ways. We'll pursue every legal avenue." But outside, the world she was trying to hold together felt like it was splintering. Later that afternoon, the hospital corridor had cleared, and Sarah re-entered the preservation lab. The metal container from Tommy's thigh sat behind a thick glass case, sterile and cryptic. She stared at it as though expecting it to speak. Inside that container were letters, final words to families, unspoken for decades. Yet now she had to choose whether to divert time and resources to retrieve a bank account that might not even exist anymore. At 3 p.m., she barged into the hospital administrator's office. He looked up from his paperwork, eyebrows raised. "We're dealing with a blocked account from Marcus Mitchell," she said, voice firm. He designated his friend, Tommy, as his power of attorney, right in his final letter. "That is legally binding in Pennsylvania. It bypasses the probate process and allows immediate access." The administrator frowned. "Only if properly documented." Sarah slammed the letter on the desk. "There's a notary stamp here, dated 2 days before he shipped out. He made Tommy the nominal power of attorney. I verified with the county clerk that both were witnessed and notarized." Her voice softened. "He intended Tommy to have that money, for his family." There was a long pause. "Send me copies," the administrator said finally. "I'll expedite the request." Sarah exhaled. The gears were turning again, not fast enough, but turning. Meanwhile, Becky found Jake sitting in the chilly hospital garden, his elbows on his knees. "I tried to enlist," he admitted, looking at the ground. "They said I'm not old enough yet." Becky crouched beside him. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I thought, that money could fix things." Jake shrugged. "I know, but maybe there's another way." He watched the leaves drifting across the lawn, turned to her. "What about the letters, Mom? Whatever's inside that metal thing. Can't those become a story? People care about that." Becky swallowed. "They do," she said. "The hospital's involved. Preservation teams, historians." Jake nodded. "I saw the news. It's gone national. Maybe we could organize something. A fundraiser? Share the link, the story." Tears glistened in Becky's eyes, both from pride and desperation. "Jake," she began, but he gently squeezed her hand. Inside, Sarah was arguing with herself, torn between practical rescue and historic legacy. She returned to Tommy's room and found him restless. His eyelids fluttered. He recognized her. "How bad is it?" he rasped, voice raspy. Sarah knelt beside him. "We hit a snag, but we might have a way forward. His letter, the power of attorney, might actually work." Tommy exhaled weakly. "Tell me more when I'm awake." He drifted again, and Sarah pressed the letter to her chest, silent tears falling. The next morning began with silence and dread. Becky had barely closed her eyes when the nurse's voice crackled through the intercom. Her father's oxygen levels had dropped sharply overnight, signs of septic shock. They were moving him back into ICU, fast. She ran through the corridors, still in yesterday's clothes, heart pounding against her ribs. The sterile smell of antiseptic and plastic struck her harder this time. Everything felt too bright, too sharp. Sarah met her outside the glass-walled room, jaw clenched, eyes shadowed. "His immune system is struggling," she said. "The infection had seeded deeper than we thought. We're pumping him with antibiotics and fluids, but his body's tired." Becky's hands trembled. He was doing better. "I know," Sarah whispered, "but sometimes the body rallies right before it falls apart." Inside, Tommy lay motionless, his face pale against the pillow. Machines surrounded him like a second skeleton. Wires, tubes, blinking lights. But it was the stillness that broke Becky. Her father had always been in motion. Even when he was quiet, he buzzed like a wire under current. This was empty. Jake stood silently beside her, fists clenched. He looked smaller than usual, not because of fear, but because everything around him suddenly felt too big. "Can I talk to him?" he asked. Becky nodded, wiping her face. "He might hear you. They say, people know when you're there." Jake stepped into the room and stood beside the bed. His eyes moved across the bruises, the needle marks, the mask. "Hey, Grandpa," he said quietly. "It's me." The monitors beeped steadily, indifferent. Jake took a deep breath. "You remember how you said some promises aren't worth dying for? That serving family matters more than serving pride?" He laughed bitterly. "You were right, and wrong." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a single envelope, aged, sealed, with Marcus Mitchell's name in the corner. One of the letters from the capsule. "Dr. Mitchell said I could take one, just one. I chose your friends. I hope you don't mind." Jake's voice trembled, but he opened the envelope carefully and began to read. "To my little girl, if this letter ever finds you, it means I didn't come home. I hate that. I hate the thought of missing your birthdays, your first bike ride, your graduation. I hate knowing someone else might have to teach you how to drive. But if I'm gone, then I need you to know that I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I loved you. I went to war for reasons bigger than myself. I stayed in it because of the man lying next to me. And I gave this letter to someone I trust with my life, Tommy M.C. Allister, because I believe he will bring it back to you when I cannot. He's braver than he thinks, Sarah. One day maybe you'll meet him, and when you do, tell him I said thank you, for being my brother, for keeping my word when I couldn't. Love, Dad." By the time Jake finished reading, his voice was cracking. The machines beeped louder for a moment. A spike. Nothing huge, but it was something. Outside the room, Sarah had been listening from the doorway. Her hand covered her mouth. Her knees nearly buckled. Her father's words. After all these years, Becky pulled her into an embrace, both women shaking from something older than grief. Relief wrapped in sorrow. Later that afternoon, as news of Tommy's condition reached the community, something unexpected happened. A group of veterans and neighbors began gathering in the front courtyard of the hospital. Someone brought candles, another brought an old speaker system, and played taps. A woman from the VA center arrived with laminated photos of Alpha Company. Someone else printed out a blown-up image of one of the letters, Marcus's letter. Jake stood in the center, holding it. Becky stepped up beside him. "Do you want to say something?" He hesitated, then nodded. Standing on the front steps of the hospital, Jake addressed the crowd. "My grandfather didn't tell stories, not because he didn't have any, but because some stories hurt too much to speak. He carried the words of 23 men in his body for over 50 years, letters meant for people who never got to say goodbye." He raised the letter. This was written by a man who never met his daughter, but tonight, his daughter heard his voice. Murmurs, tears. Jake continued, "My family's been through a lot lately. We've nearly lost our house. We nearly lost him, but this right here, reminds me why we fight to hold on. Because some legacies are too big to bury. He paused. I know I'm only 16. But I also know this, what my grandfather did. It matters, and I don't think he should have to die for people to remember that. The crowd clapped, some softly, some through tears. Local reporters had been recording. By morning, the footage would be all over the news. Inside the ICU, Tommy's breathing changed. The nurse leaned in. He's stabilizing. Sarah rushed in, checking vitals, checking blood pressure, heart rate. Becky followed, praying under her breath. Tommy's eyelids fluttered. Slowly. Then opened. His voice was barely audible, but it was there. Did she get it? He asked. Sarah stepped forward, tears streaking her cheeks. Yes, she whispered. I heard him. Tommy nodded, satisfied. Becky took his hand. You're not done yet, Dad, she said. Not even close. And for the first time in days, he smiled. The next morning, sunlight poured gently through the ICU window, washing the sterile white walls in a quiet gold. It was the first peaceful light Becky had seen in days. She sat beside her father's bed, her fingers gently laced around his, studying the deep. Lines on his hand like old road maps, each wrinkle, each scar, a history unspoken. Tommy's eyes opened slowly, clearer than they'd been in a week. You're still here, he rasped. Becky smiled through her exhaustion. You sound disappointed. He chuckled, a dry crackle in his throat. I was hoping to wake up somewhere warmer, with your mother yelling at me. Becky squeezed his hand. She'd say you've still got work to do down here. He turned his head, meeting her eyes, and she'd be right. A few hours later, Sarah entered the room with a box in her arms, a heavy-duty archival case, sealed tight, labeled with the names of 23 soldiers. She placed it gently on the tray beside the bed and sat down. They finished the initial preservation, she said softly. All 23 letters are intact. We now have the full manifest. Tommy's lips trembled slightly. I never read a single one, he said. Not even your father's. I wasn't supposed to. I was just... The courier. Sarah looked at him carefully. Would you be willing to tell us the full story? Tommy nodded. It was July of 1969. Our unit was pinned in the jungle near Quang Tri. We'd been hit hard. Ambush, mortar fire, total chaos. We lost 10 men in under an hour. There was a moment we thought none of us were getting out. That night, Marcus got an idea. He paused, eyes unfocused, seeing another place. He passed around a pad of paper, told the guys, write to someone, tell them what you never got to say. At first they laughed, teased him, but one by one they started writing. Mothers, wives, kids, best friends. Some just wrote to God. He swallowed. By dawn, 23 letters sat in a pile. Marcus and we sealed them in a waterproof tube, the kind medics used for maps. He told me, if I don't make it, you keep this safe. You bring it home, you find a way. Sarah's eyes glistened. And then, we were hit again that afternoon. Marcus took a round in the chest. Didn't die right away. He crawled to me, bleeding, and shoved the tube into my hands. Promise me, he said. Promise you'll carry us home. Becky's throat tightened. How did it end up inside you? I'd been hit in the leg. Bad. The field medic, Maria Santos, knew evac was coming. We had seconds. She had the surgical kit ready. She asked me one question, can you carry it? I nodded. He lifted his hand, tapping the side of his thigh gently. She made a cut, slid the container deep into the wound, packed it in gauze, and stitched me shut. Told the evac team it was shrapnel. No one questioned it. Sarah leaned forward. You could have told someone. Decades ago, I almost did. Once, after Margaret died. But I figured, the world forgot those boys. Maybe their letters didn't matter anymore. Becky wiped her face. They matter. More than ever. Sarah opened the archival box carefully. Inside, each letter was stored in an acid-free sleeve, labeled with the name of the soldier, their service number, and the intended recipient. Tommy reached in with shaking hands and pulled one free. This one, he whispered. Private Darnell Green. He had a newborn daughter when we shipped out. Never met her. He passed it to Sarah. Maybe you can help find her. Sarah nodded, heart racing. We'll find them all. Tommy leaned back, exhausted. Then I've done my part. Becky looked between them. We can't keep this a secret anymore, can we? Sarah shook her head. No, and we shouldn't. These men, they deserve to be heard. Outside the window, A breeze stirred the last autumn leaves. History, buried for half a century, had begun to breathe again. 2 days later, the conference room at Veterans Memorial Hospital had transformed into a nerve center. Letters were carefully read, cataloged, and cross-referenced by a team of archivists, military historians, and trauma counselors. Tommy sat at the edge of the room, blanket over his legs, watching silently as men and women half his age handled the ghosts of his past with reverent hands. Sarah approached with one sleeve in hand, her eyes unreadable. "This one's different," she said softly. "It's not addressed to family. It's not even written on a page. It's scribbled on the inside of a ration box flap, in blood." Tommy frowned. "Who wrote it?" She turned the paper over. "Corporal Levi Henderson." Tommy's face stiffened. "Levi? You knew him? I carried his body off the hill myself." Sarah looked at him, then read aloud. "If anyone ever reads this, please know what really happened at Hill 93. It wasn't just enemy fire. We were set up. I heard it over the radio. Someone high up pulled us out of position and left the flank open. I watched our own air support hit friendlies. It was friendly fire. They covered it up, said it was VC mortar, but it wasn't. I'm writing this with what's left of my hand. If this note doesn't make it home, maybe it's better. But if it does, God help whoever kept this quiet." The room froze. Sarah folded the scrap slowly. "There are coordinates, a date, a unit call sign. It's all here." Tommy's throat was tight. "I remember that night. It didn't make sense. Too accurate, too fast. We always suspected something, but we were told to shut up and move on." Sarah leaned against the table. "If this is true, it means the Hill 93 ambush wasn't just an ambush. It was a mistake, and they buried it." A historian in the back of the room, wearing Department of Defense credentials, stood silently. "This could open a classified inquiry. You understand what you've uncovered?" Tommy didn't respond. He only nodded slowly, his hands trembling more than they had since the surgery. Becky, standing in the doorway, paled. "You mean they knew and they lied?" The room was silent for a moment. "Not everyone," Sarah said. "But someone did." Later that evening, the story broke online. An anonymous leak, likely from someone in the historical team, had published Levi Henderson's letter on a military archive forum. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with hashtags, #Hill93Truth, the 23 letters, #ThePromiseKeeper. News vans lined the block outside the hospital. Becky stood at her father's window, watching the cameras and reporters gather like vultures. "Dad, do you want to speak to them?" Tommy shook his head. "Not yet. Not until the other families hear their letters first. But they'll ask you about Henderson, about what you knew." "I didn't know," Tommy said flatly, "but I suspected. And now that I do know, I won't be quiet." Jake, who had just returned from his shift at the foundation office, stepped inside, holding a thick manila envelope. "We found Henderson's sister. She lives in Des Moines. Never got a military report. They told her he died instantly. No mention of Hill 93. No friendly fire. Nothing." Tommy sighed. "Tell her I'll call personally. If she wants to come here, I'll pay for her ticket myself." That night, Sarah found Tommy alone in the chapel. The small hospital space glowed with dim votive candles and the soft scent of old wood. "I keep asking myself," he whispered, "did Marcus know?" She sat beside him, folding her hands. "Maybe, maybe not. But he trusted you. He trusted that one day the truth would matter." Tommy exhaled. "I spent decades thinking the truth was in those letters. Turns out it was also in the silences, in what we weren't allowed to say." Outside, the hospital's security lights flickered over the news vans still parked along the sidewalk. Inside, the flame in the chapel danced softly in reflection. One man's secret burden had become a national reckoning, and the truth, at long last, was being heard. 3 days later, the conference room of the newly renamed Marcus Mitchell Veterans Care Center had been transformed into something resembling a wartime strategy bunker. The usual whiteboards and hospital charts had been replaced by military files, television, screens, and a single flag, folded and framed in honor of Sergeant Marcus Mitchell. Tommy sat at the head of the room, flanked by Becky and Jake. Across the table sat 2 representatives from the Department of Defense, a legal advisor from the Pentagon, and Colonel Emery Walsh, a decorated officer with piercing eyes and the kind of career that left no room for emotion. Also present were Sarah Mitchell, in her role as both chief of staff and daughter of a fallen soldier, and 5 of the 23 families who had already received their letters. Each carried their own grief, now reawakened by revelations that their sons may have died not by enemy hands, but by betrayal. Colonel Walsh opened the meeting, his voice clipped and precise. "Mr. McAllister, we appreciate you bringing these letters forward. As you're aware, the content of Corporal Henderson's message contains allegations that, if proven true, could reclassify a decades-old military action and implicate individuals long since retired or deceased. The department is here to investigate with discretion." Tommy looked up, his eyes calm but unyielding. "This doesn't need to be buried in more red tape, Colonel. It needs to be told. These families deserve the truth." "The truth," the colonel replied evenly, "often comes with consequences. Not just for you, Mr. McAllister, but for units, divisions, and entire campaigns whose legacy may be altered." Jake scoffed. "So your concern is the Army's image?" Becky placed a calming hand on her son's arm. Colonel Walsh turned to Sarah. "Dr. Mitchell, you're both a civilian and the daughter of Sergeant Mitchell. I assume your stake in this is personal." Sarah's voice didn't waver. "It is, and it's professional. My father's name is etched into a wall of honor. If that honor was built on lies, I want to know. And if it wasn't, then telling the truth can only strengthen it." Tommy's voice cut through the room. Corporal Maria Santos knew what she was doing when she hid those letters. She didn't send them home because she feared exactly what's happening now, that they'd be intercepted, silenced, discredited. "Well, I kept them safe for 52 years, and now they're speaking." Colonel Walsh sat back in his chair, clasping his hands. "Mr. McAllister, with your permission, we'd like to take possession of Corporal Henderson's letter for further authentication." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "So it can disappear into some archive box like the rest of them? We assure you, this is standard." "No," Sarah said firmly, surprising even herself. "It stays here. We've already had it authenticated by military historians and preservationists. The ink, the field stationery, the handwriting, they match. There's no doubt it's legitimate, and it's already been leaked to the public." Walsh turned slightly, his voice darkening. "Which brings me to another point, the leak. It has caused significant unrest among veteran communities. We're fielding calls, public statements, and demands for congressional hearings. This is no longer a private matter." Tommy leaned forward, both hands braced on the table. "Good. Maybe it's time someone answered for what happened on Hill 93. Maybe it's time the truth served those who died, not just those who survived." A silence followed, heavy and electric. Then quietly, an older woman at the far end of the table, Mrs. Bonnie Grant, whose son had been one of the 23, stood. "My boy wrote in his letter that he forgave the Army before he died. Said war is chaos. Said his last thoughts were of home, not blame." She looked around the room, eyes glistening. "But if another mother out there is still wondering why her son died in the wrong place at the wrong time, we owe her the truth. We owe all of them that." Sarah nodded slowly. "We've scheduled a press conference, tomorrow, in the auditorium. We plan to present the letters that have been authenticated and offer statements on behalf of the families." "You're turning this into a media circus," the Pentagon advisor said sharply. "No," Tommy said, his voice rising. "We're turning it into a memorial." Walsh stared hard at him. "You realize the risk you're taking. I took a bigger one when I carried those letters across 2 continents and through half a century," Tommy replied. "This isn't about risk. This is about purpose." After the meeting adjourned, Tommy remained in the conference room alone, fingers gently, brushing over the envelope marked from Marcus, to be read if I don't return. He hadn't opened it publicly. Not yet. That was for tomorrow. Sarah entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You still good for tomorrow?" He looked up at her, eyes tired but resolute. "I've lived with these words in my body longer than I've had them in my hands. Tomorrow, they leave me for good. That scares me more than I'd like to admit. They're not leaving you," she said gently, handing him the coffee. "They're becoming part of everyone else." He took a sip, then smiled faintly. "You're your father's daughter, you know." She smiled back. "That's the highest praise I could hope for." Outside the room, the first trucks for national news coverage began to arrive. Flags were being raised, chairs arranged, and the town of Millbrook, once a forgotten dot on the map, was preparing to become the stage for a story that had waited half a century to be told. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Rows of chairs overflowed into the aisles. Veterans in dress uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder beside teenage students, journalists, grieving families, and curious townspeople. Cameras lined the back wall, local news, national broadcasters, even an international crew from the BBC. At the front of the stage, under a banner that read the 23 letters, a homecoming of truth, sat a single podium, flanked by a simple wooden chair and a small glass case, the original container Tommy had carried inside his body for 52 years. The room quieted as Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped to the podium. "Thank you all for being here," she began, voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "Today, we are not unveiling a scandal. We are not accusing or condemning. Today, we are giving voice to 23 men who never made it home, and honoring the man who carried them here." Applause rippled through the room, slow and solemn. Sarah continued. "Some of these letters are personal. Some are heartbreaking. One is explosive. But all of them speak to something deeper than war. They speak to memory, to duty, to the promise that those who are lost are never truly forgotten." She turned to look off stage. "Mr. Thomas McAllister has something he'd like to say." There was a long pause. Then Tommy entered from stage right, walking slowly but unaided, leaning slightly on a cane. The room rose to its feet. Veterans saluted. Civilians clapped. Jake placed a hand over his heart, pride radiating from his face. Tommy reached the podium and waited for the room to settle. He stared out over the sea of faces, some familiar, most not, and took a slow breath. "My name is Thomas McAllister. Most people just call me Tommy. I was born in 1945, drafted in 67, deployed to Vietnam in 68. And in 1969, I made a promise to a man named Marcus Mitchell." He held up the envelope, yellowed, creased, the seal still unbroken. "He told me, if I don't come back, this is yours. When the time is right, read it." Tommy's fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "I've never read this before." "Not until now," he began, voice rough but unwavering. "Tommy, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. And if that's the case, you probably did something stupid to keep my ass alive. So, thanks. I asked you to carry those letters because I couldn't bear the thought of them being lost, or censored, or forgotten. We both know what's happening out here doesn't always make it back home the way it should. I want to ask you for one more thing. Someday, when the world is ready, not when the war ends, but when people are willing to listen, I want you to open them, not just for the families, for us, for the men whose last words weren't radioed in or written in official reports, for the guys who joked through fear, prayed through silence, and died thinking maybe no one would remember them. Let this be their monument. If this is in your hands, then it means I trusted you more than I ever trusted this country. And I don't say that lightly. I believe in you, Tommy, and I believe in the truth. Hold the line. Marcus." Tommy paused, lifting his eyes. "I have no fancy degrees. I don't speak for a party or a government, but I speak for the men who wrote those letters. And I speak as the man who carried them inside his body for more than half a century. You may call that honor, or trauma, or foolish loyalty. But to me, it was a promise." He looked toward the families sitting in the front row. "Some of you lost sons, brothers, husbands. You were told they died heroes. And they did. But what you weren't told was what they felt in their final hours. The words they wanted you to hear. Those words are now yours. And no bureaucracy can change that." He turned his gaze to the cameras. "To the Department of Defense, I say this. You have the power to rewrite reports. You have the power to redact. But you no longer have the power to silence. The truth is out. And we're not asking permission anymore." The crowd erupted in applause. Deep, thunderous, cathartic. Tommy stepped back, but Sarah joined him and took the mic. "One of the letters, Corporal Henderson's, has raised serious questions about a friendly fire incident at Hill 93. That letter has been authenticated, and more investigations will follow." She looked to the families. "This is just the beginning. We will pursue every truth these letters lead us to, and we will do it together." As the crowd quieted again, Becky stepped forward with Jake at her side. She held a final item, a folded American flag, weathered and sun-faded. This flag flew over Hill 93, recovered by Alpha Company's medic, Maria Santos, Becky said. "It survived a war, a burial, and a silence. Today, it flies again, Above this hospital, above this story, and above the memory of 23 men who finally made it home. She unfolded it, and with Sarah and Jake's help, draped it over the glass case. Outside, the hospital flagpole hoisted a replica, flapping in the autumn wind. The cameras zoomed in. The world watched, and somewhere in the back of the room, a young veteran who had never served in Vietnam stood with tears in his eyes. Because the truth, when spoken without shame, echoes across generations. In the days following the press conference, the town of Millbrook transformed, from a quiet Pennsylvania dot on the map into a symbol of national reckoning. Every major news outlet ran coverage of Tommy's speech. Headlines flooded TV screens and morning papers. A letter carried through war and time 23 voices. From Vietnam Speak Again. One man's promise breaks 52-year silence. Social media exploded. Veterans from every era posted tributes. Some shared their own stories. Others, for the first time in decades, said thank you, not to a country, but to each other. Outside the hospital, the makeshift memorial grew by the hour. Flags, photographs, candles, notes addressed to the fallen. Even children came by with crayons and flowers, asking their parents why people were crying. The ripple reached Washington by the end of the week. Senator Marjorie Hale of Illinois called for a formal congressional inquiry into the events of Hill 93. Military historians and journalists across the country began combing old mission records. A Freedom of Information Act request was filed to unseal sealed communications from the 1969 mission. The Department of Defense released a careful diplomatic statement. We recognize the courage of Mr. M.C. Allister and the families of Alpha Company. The department is reviewing records relevant to Hill 93 and will cooperate fully with any congressional oversight. Tommy read it in the hospital cafeteria, squinting at the small print. He sighed. Same song, he murmured. Different verse. Becky looked up from her coffee. It's still something. 50 years ago they wouldn't even give a statement. Tommy nodded slowly. I know. It's just, when you've waited this long, even justice feels late. Meanwhile, Jake had been invited to speak at a local veterans event, and then, another, his voice unexpectedly becoming a bridge between generations. He didn't read statistics. He didn't give political takes. He told stories, his grandfather's, Marcus's, Levi Henderson's, the ones that didn't make the textbooks, and people listened. In one small church in Texas, a woman heard Jake read her uncle's name out loud for the first time in public. In Montana, a widow of a long-lost soldier wept as she read a love letter she never knew existed. Across the country, the letters were not just read, they were felt. Back in Millbrook, the hospital lobby was redesigned. A new exhibit stood in the entryway, the Promise Room. Encased in glass, the letters, now preserved permanently, each displayed with the name, date, and branch of service. The original metal tubes sat in the center, scarred and silent. People came from everywhere. Veterans rolled in on walkers. Families took road trips. Teachers brought classrooms. Some stayed for hours. Others just stood in front of one letter, tears silently tracing their cheeks. Sarah stood in the exhibit late one night, long after visiting hours had ended. She stared at her father's letter. His handwriting, his honesty. She hadn't cried on stage, she hadn't cried during the interviews, but now, alone, she finally let herself feel the weight. Behind her, footsteps echoed softly. It was Tommy. He stood beside her, not speaking for a while. Finally he said, I used to think I was carrying those letters for them, but maybe I was also carrying them for me. Sarah nodded, still staring at the glass. And maybe for all of us. Tommy exhaled. I thought that once I handed them over, I'd feel finished, but I don't. She looked at him gently. Because grief doesn't finish, memory doesn't finish. But what you did, what you gave us, gives them something they never had before, the final word. He nodded, slowly, eyes moist. A day later, Tommy was discharged. The staff clapped as he left. A nurse handed him a small medal, handmade by a local school class, with the words Truth Keeper printed in childlike marker. Jake rode in the front seat of the borrowed van, beaming. At home, the mailbox overflowed. Letters, cards, a hand-knit quilt from a woman in Kentucky with embroidered names of the 23, and one brown envelope, government issue. Becky opened it carefully. Inside, your foreclosure has been rescinded. A private donor has paid the outstanding balance. Property fully reinstated. She stared at the page. Jake peeked over her shoulder. Who would? But Becky had already turned to the last line, anonymous donation, per request of the Mitchell Foundation. Jake blinked. Wait, their family? Becky covered her mouth, eyes flooding. Tommy, sitting quietly in the living room, said only this. A promise kept always echoes further than we expect. And outside the house, the autumn leaves began to fall like whispers. The sky above Vietnam was softer than Tommy remembered. 2 years after he was medevaced from the jungle, with shrapnel in his thigh and ghosts in his chest, he had returned. Not as a soldier, not as a patient, but as a man finally ready to let go. Becky walked beside him, supporting his arm as they stepped off the small transport vehicle. Behind them, Jake carried a folded American flag and a sealed envelope. Their translator, a kind woman named Lynn, gestured ahead, the small hill just beyond the trees. Hill 93. The local government had granted special permission for the visit. No press, no ceremony, just them. Tommy stared at the slope. Once it had been a place of fire, chaos, and death. Now it was covered in tall grass and white blossoms. Nature had reclaimed what war had scorched. But Tommy could still see it. Sandbags, smoke, the curve of a helmet disappearing into gunfire. The way Marcus had looked at him, eyes full of quiet knowing, just before the bullets found him. They reached the summit slowly. At the top, Lynn placed a small stone marker on the ground, inscribed, in both English and Vietnamese, to those who never left this hill. Tommy knelt, slowly, his knees creaking, and took a long, silent breath. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the last letter, not one from the 23, not from Marcus, but from himself. Becky had found it weeks ago while going through a box of her mother's belongings. A small envelope marked in Tommy's handwriting, to myself. For the end, I wrote this, Tommy said softly, the night before I left the base, when I knew I was coming home, and the others weren't. He opened it. The paper trembled in his hand. Tommy, if you're reading this, you made it out. You did what they asked. You stayed alive. You carried the letters. You kept the promise. But don't let survival become your punishment. You're not just the man who buried others. You're the one who remembered. One day you'll feel like speaking. One day you'll feel like living again. When that day comes, let it. Don't be afraid of peace. Don't be afraid of joy. And don't keep carrying us. Let us rest. Let you rest. With love, yourself. Tommy folded the letter and placed it beneath the stone marker. Becky, tears streaking her face, knelt beside him and placed the flag next to it. Jake said nothing, only took his grandfather's hand and held it. They stood like that for a long time, 3 generations on a quiet hill, surrounded by wind and memory. Later that evening, they returned to their guest house in Hue. The local children had left small offerings outside, flowers, drawings, paper cranes. Becky read aloud the note left by one child. Thank you for remembering the men who died here. And thank you for not forgetting ours too. Tommy smiled gently. I came here thinking I was closing a chapter, he said. But maybe I was reopening one that belonged to all of us. Back home, the Promise Room welcomed over 200,000 visitors in the first 3 months. A traveling exhibit was announced, starting in Washington, D.C. and moving across the country. School curriculums began including the letters of Hill 93 as a module on personal testimony and wartime ethics. Jake was invited to speak at a TEDx event titled Carrying Memory, What My Grandfather Taught Me About Truth. He began the talk by holding up the rusted metal tube. This, he said, weighed less than a pound, but it carried more than most men ever will. Becky resumed work at the hospital part-time, and every Wednesday afternoon she would volunteer in the Promise Room, guiding visitors, especially teenagers, and telling them that some heroes don't wear medals, they carry paper. And Tommy, he began writing. Not memoirs, not confessions, stories, some about the war, some not. He joined a veteran writers group, took his coffee black again, started listening to jazz. On Sundays he sat on the porch and played checkers with Jake, who let him win just enough to keep things interesting. One autumn afternoon, Sarah came to visit. She brought a letter. It was from the daughter of Private Darnell Green. I read my father's letter every night. I never knew the sound of his voice, but now I know the shape of his words. And somehow, that's enough. Thank you for carrying him home. Tommy held the letter like it was made of glass, then smiled. I think, he said, I finally made it home too. And outside the leaves whispered in the wind like old friends calling his name. Sometimes, the heaviest things we carry aren't weapons or burdens. They're memories, promises, words never spoken. And when those words finally find their way into the light, across time, across silence, they remind us that healing isn't just for the living. It's for the dead, too. As the wind moves gently across Hill 93, imagine it whispering every name never carved into stone, every letter never delivered, every truth that almost stayed buried. What promise have you kept? Or maybe, what truth are you still carrying? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one. Because some stories aren't just worth hearing, they're worth remembering.